This is the second presentation in the nervous system. The neurotransmitters are the chemicals that the nervous system uses to communicate. Acetylcholine is one of the more common neurotransmitters. It is used in many PNS nerves and some CNS nerves. Its actions can be excitatory or inhibitory in that it can turn something on or turn something off. It is used by all parasympathetic neurons and acts to slow the heart rate by inhibiting the sympathetics. It is cholinergic because it contains choline. It is also involved with cognitive functions, memory, digestion, saliva production, and plays a role in Alzheimer's disease. It is also affected by certain antidepressant drugs and commonly has dry mouth as a side effect. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter that has possible functions in learning and memory. It is also involved with Alzheimer's disease and epilepsy. Aspartate is another common excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, is inhibitory and is affected by some anti-anxiety medicines like diazepam or Valium. Glycine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So while it may seem that you don't get a lot of information with some of these neurotransmitters, one thing to keep in mind is our knowledge and understanding of the neurotransmitters is far from being complete at this point. Norepinephrine is a common neurotransmitter involved with all sympathetic responses. It plays a role in states of arousal, dreams, moods, and gastrointestinal activity. It is a monoamine because it is made from a modified amino acid. In addition to the sympathetics, it is found in the pons, thalamus, and midbrain. It is affected by the class of drugs known as the MAOIs, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and tricyclic antidepressants. You may see warnings on certain medications saying do not consume with MAOIs since there is limited amount of enzymes in processing these in the body. Dopamine is another monoamine found in the basal ganglia of the brain. It plays a role in emotional responses, addiction, pleasure, and regulating skeletal muscle tone. It is the neurotransmitter involved with Parkinson's disease, and excesses of dopamine are also found in one form of schizophrenia. The endorphins are the natural painkillers. They are also involved in memory, learning, and states of euphoria and pleasure. This is the neurotransmitter associated with a runner's high. Natural endorphins are not believed to be harmful to the body at all, but the synthetic forms like opium and morphine and heroin are highly addictive. The term endorphin actually means endogenous morphine. Nitric oxide is a relatively recently discovered neurotransmitter which appears to play a role in learning and memory. It plays a role in expanding blood vessels and is going to be short-term involved in the blood vessels and dissipate quickly and break down quickly. Certain supplements are going to help to trigger this release. The amino acid aspartate The amino acid L-arginine will contribute to the production of more nitric oxide. The role of nitric oxide in expanding blood vessels is also going to be a similar mechanism to what the drug Viagra does. Serotonin is found in several places, including the cerebral cortex, spinal cord, gastrointestinal, and cardiovascular system. It is made from the amino acid tryptophan. Serotonin is involved with sensory perception, temperature, some pain regulation, mood, appetite, blood pressure, and hormonal activity. Many of the newer antidepressants, the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SRIs, are going to affect levels of serotonin. Also, the illegal drug ecstasy will trigger massive releases of serotonin. Massive releases of serotonin can be dangerous because of serotonin sickness that can cause problems with the heart and even death. The two branches of the autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic response is the fight or flight response and always uses epinephrine and norepinephrine. These neurotransmitters are also found in the adrenal medulla as hormones to help support and prolong the sympathetic responses. Neurons carrying the sympathetic stimulation will branch off of the sympathetic trunk, which is along the thoracic spine. In this image here, you can see where the thoracic spine has nerves that come in that are all going to carry a sympathetic message to all of the organs. On this side here, you can see where the cranial region is going to have nerves that can connect to the organs, as well as the sacral region for the cranial-sacral control. In the parasympathetic response, the heart rate and blood pressure decrease and the pupils constrict. Here you can see these nerves exiting in here, and they will use acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. This is referred to as the cranial-sacral portion of the control. And you can see this picture here enlarged. The sympathetic response will consist of changes such as pupil dilation to allow in more light and increased blood flow with an increase in the heart rate and blood pressure. The airways will dilate and expand to take in more oxygen, and blood flow will shift to the skeletal muscle. The liver will break down its glycogen stores to increase the glucose available for energy. In the parasympathetic response, the heart rate and blood pressure will decrease and the pupils constrict. Lacrimal gland activity will increase, and the pancreas will increase its secretion of the digestive juices. The liver will shift into the detoxification and fat processing mode to help with the digestion, and the rest of digestion will also increase. Blood flow will shift to the digestive organs, and the bladder will prepare for urine storage. The lacrimal gland activity may seem a little bit odd to have as a parasympathetic response, but it is a way that we will maintain the eyes with those secretions to clean out the eyes. You can actually see this if you look at a small child who has fallen down. When they get up, initially they're just fine, but when they realize that everything is going to be okay, the parent goes over to comfort them, and they can go from being sympathetic back to the parasympathetic response. That's often when you're going to see them start to cry. The meninges are a series of membranes surrounding the CNS. The dura mater is the tougher outermost layer. The arachnoid mater is the middle layer and takes on a spiderweb type of arrangement. The pia mater is the delicate innermost layer, which is adhered directly to the CNS. Between the dura mater and pia mater, we have the subarachnoid space, which contains the arachnoid mater and the CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid. The terminus of the spinal cord is about at the level of L1 and continues as the individual nerve fibers called the cauda equina. Because the spinal cord terminates at about the level of L1, when an epidural or a lumbar puncture is done to collect cerebral spinal fluid, it is done just below that level, so there is no risk of actually having the needle touch the spinal cord. The gray matter in the spinal cord takes on an H shape, which you can see in this picture here. The legs in the front form the ventral horns. These carry motor neurons exiting the spinal cord on the anterior side. The legs in the back form the posterior horn. These carry sensory neurons coming in and out of the spinal cord on the posterior side of the spinal cord. Pathways in the CNS are referred to as tracts. The ascending tract will carry sensory information from the body to the brain. The descending tract will carry motor information from the brain to the body. Although these nerves will come in and out of the spinal cord at this particular location, they are generally not transmitted the entire way in the spinal cord in these locations. That will depend on what type of message is being carried and where in the brain it is going to. A nerve pathway in the CNS is called a tract, and a pathway in the PNS is called a reflex. The spinal reflex refers to the pathway a nerve takes that passes through the spinal cord. Information comes in through the sensory neuron, travels to an inner neuron in the CNS, which can make one or more connections, and then travels to a motor neuron. They are spinal reflexes because they involve the spinal nerves, and the reflex arc passes through the spinal cord. This is probably quite different from what you typically picture for a reflex, which is a deep tendon reflex, a very specific type of spinal reflex. The typical reflex arc begins at the receptor at the end of the sensory neuron, which detects a stimulus. For our example, imagine it is a pain receptor when you touch a hot stove burner. The information will then travel through the sensory neuron along the afferent pathway to the CNS. The afferent pathway is another term for the sensory pathway. When it gets to the CNS, it will make a connection to go up and tell the brain about the burning pain, but it will also make a connection to the motor neuron in the spinal cord at that level. The effector carries the impulse along the efferent or motor pathway to the effector. The effector, which is usually a muscle or a gland, carries out the response. In our example, it will pull the hand away. It is a shorter distance to travel across the spinal cord to carry the message to pull the hand away than it is to reach the brain. So you will actually remove your hand before you experience the pain in your brain. This protects us from sustaining more damage by the delay and having the message travel all the way to the brain and back. A cranial reflex is a nerve pathway where the reflex arc involves a cranial nerve.
The speed of information processing partially depends on the number of neurons involved in the task. A complex voluntary behavior, such as identifying and reaching for an apple, involves multiple brain systems, sensory, cognitive, and motor, and many neural connections. The elapsed time between recognizing the object and initiating a behavior is thus relatively long. While complex voluntary behaviors are certainly adaptive, there are situations, such as the rapid withdrawal from dangerous stimuli, that require immediate action. A rapid response is one of the advantages of the reflex arc, which involves only a few neurons. In a simple reflex, the entire signaling sequence detection, processing, and response is handled by the spinal cord, without the need for input from higher brain regions. Indeed, conscious perception occurs after the reflexive withdrawal has already begun. Let's examine the reflex arc in more detail. First, specialized sensory fibers in the skin detect the painful stimulus and relay this information to nerve cells in the spinal cord. The information is carried all the way from the skin to the spinal cord by a single sensory neuron without any intervening synaptic connections. The sensory fibers enter the spinal cord and synapse upon the interneurons within the spinal cord gray matter. These interneurons, in turn, synapse upon the motor neurons that control the skeletal muscles. In this case, the flexor muscles in the front of the arm are instructed to contract, while the extensor muscles in the back of the arm relax. By exciting some motor neurons and inhibiting others, the interneurons serve the important function of controlling muscle pairs to generate movement. In this case, the motor neurons that control the flexor muscles are excited, while the motor neurons that control the extensor muscles are inhibited.
The IVF is the intervertebral foramina. This is the space created between two vertebrae which allows the spinal nerve to exit out of the spinal cord. When the nerve exits the spinal cord and becomes a peripheral nerve, it is surrounded by a membrane known as the endoneurium. Some nerves are considered mixed nerves because they carry both motor and sensory information. The motor exits the ventral horn and the sensory exits the dorsal horn, and both move lateral and come together in the peripheral nerve. Sometimes nerves will recombine after they exit the spinal cord and form a plexus. This is seen at the limbs to help preserve function in case of injury. The examples seen in the next slides are going to be of the brachial plexus. They recombine in a predictable pattern to make several new nerves carrying the nerve fibers of one or more nerve roots. So here you can see one of the things with the brachial plexus is you've got these 5 neurons. They come together to make the trunks. They are renamed when they form the divisions and the cords, and what you end up with are 5 new nerves that are going to be the combination of these different nerve roots. This picture also shows where these come off. You can see here that you actually have part of this nerve root fiber come out and become part of multiple different peripheral nerves.